All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our Technical Advisory Committee for Monday, November 22nd, 2021. First order of business is the summary notes from our October 20th meeting. I need any questions or comments on those notes or a motion to approve said notes.
Motion to approve.
And I assume one of those was seconded.
Second.
Anybody opposed, say nay. Hearing none, I assume they're passed. Let's go into the performance measure weightings for the transaction update. Dr. Shree.
Thank you. Thank you for the committee for the hard work you have done so far. This is kind of, we are at the last moment of our last kind of work before transaction analysis can start. The next one. So far, as you know, you all worked on, discussed, and we came back to you with all kinds of feedback we received from other committees, and we looked at that on the transaction goals, objectives, and performance measures over the last 2 or 3 rounds of meetings. And we took all your feedback, your final recommended goals, objectives, and measures, along with the recommendations from the other 2 committees, the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee and Planning and Programming Committee, which both recommended the same set of measures. They didn't change anything. They recommended as it is. And Authority looked at all that, and they also approved the same set of goals, objectives, and measures at their November 18th meeting last Thursday. So this is good that now we don't have to go back, and if they have approved something different, we would have had this meeting differently. We would have been discussing now what. If the measures were different, then how do we first understand why they were different and then start talking about the weights, but they approved the same set of measures. So that's where we are, and as we discussed last time, today, now we need to take action on what weights or how we want to spread the weights across these 10 performance measures. Once you recommend that, the same thing will happen with the other 2 committees, and then it will go to the Authority at the December 8th meeting, where we expect them to look at all these different recommendations and make their own recommendation. Once that happens, Talia and team will take these guidances and start running the model for the next month, 2 months. And they will be parallelly working on 6-year program analysis too. So there will be a lot of analytical work going on in, from mid-December to probably mid-February at least. And during that same time, they're also be working on finalizing the scenarios, 4 or 5, however different number of scenarios we come up with, and then see how this transaction plan will perform in those different under those different scenarios. And then once we have all that information, we go to the public, show them the results, and get their input back, and you know the process after that. Towards the end of calendar year 2022, we hope to complete all this and adopt the plan. And and then as I said in the beginning, we need to have this weight so the consultant team can start analyzing the projects and come up with the results of this analysis. I wouldn't dwell too much. We already showed you this and discussed. We have 3 goals: enhance mobility, increase accessibility, and improve resiliency. That's what we want to achieve. How we want to achieve is through the core values: equity, sustainability, and safety. And it's not like there is one-on-one relation. It could be many-to-one relations or many-to-many relations, because each of these goals can work towards achieving any of those three core values. This is a set of goals, objectives, and measures, 3 goals, 7 objectives, and 10 performance measures that you approve. The last column shows how they align with the 3 core values. Some of these I already mentioned. The 3 committees, each committee as well as PCSE and TPC will be asked to recommend weights for each of these 10 measures. Then at the committee level, we will average that. We have 6 members attending today, so we'll take all those 6 values that you all give. We average it out for this committee, 1 recommendation. Similarly, we will have recommendations from other committees, so 3 potentially different recommendations. We present all those 3 to the authority as well as an average of all those. That's the process. We will, at that, once we take the average, we will round it up to the nearest 5th, because we don't want to have a weight that is like 8.325. So we will round it up to the nearest 5 for ease of understanding. And we for our own understanding of how these priorities, these weights will add up to for the core values, we can do that summing up and show that too. But that's not the weights are what we are looking for, but we can also see it in a different way based on the core values, how each core value gets priority or importance. The next 2 I already mentioned. We will take those recommendations to the authority in December, and they obviously they can look at all these things and still go with a different set of weight that is still possible. We showed this slide in the last round. This is just a beginning as a starting point for you to see how the public weight different priorities that we showed in the online survey. We also showed how they relate to these objectives and objectives we had, not necessarily the measures per se. Those priorities that we showed in our online survey were mapped to the objective, not to the performance measures. So you can see at the goal level or the objective level how the public weighted them. And that's just a starting point for you to as a reference, but it's up to you to decide how you want to put that weights. Once you give us a set of weights, each one of you, we can pull it up on an Excel sheet, average it out, and show you what that looks like as a committee, and we can have some more discussion on that. And then, if you want to revise your based on the discussions, if you think you need to change the weights you already given in a different way, we can do that. And once we reach to a point where you all think that this looks good, you can take an action on that. What that is. That's all I have as an introduction to this exercise. This is the most important one we could be doing today. Keith, do you have anything else to add?
Thanks, Shri, Chair Boyce, members of the committee. I just wanted to add one thing that came from the authority meeting, and I apologize if I look kind of weirdly blue on my screen. The authority did approve the goals, objectives, and performance measures, as Shri stated. There was one not changed to any of that, but a motion that on slide 6, which was just on your screen, that we would add a statement to the effect of transit may include HOV, and this was really just a recognition of the transportation potential for HOV solutions, and in making that kind of motion, that was kind of memorialized. So although we don't show that statement on this table, that statement will be included going forward. So again, the statement was transit may include HOV.
And is that in all of the performance measures? For example, in C2, does transit include HOV in that measure?
Well, the statement is transit may include, so it isn't prescriptive, and the judgment is really left to us and the consultant team to apply that request as appropriate as we go forward. What we did stress to the authority members is that HOV is kind of classed as a mode within our modelling structure, and so any effects related to HOVs will be fully captured. It's just that particular phrase was requested to be added because none of the measures explicitly say HOV.
There was a concern that HOV was not being accounted for in the measures, although we understand, I hope, that the HOV is accounted for in both the autos and transit. Transit being HOV by nature, autos where people are making the mode choice of having more than 3 people in the vehicle are able to use hot lanes for free, or HOV facilities like on the Dulles Toll Road, which is an HOV 3.
But I assume, for example, measure A1, person hours of delay in autos. 4 people in a car, which is an HOV, would get counted as persons in autos, not persons in
Correct.
transit.
That's correct.
So that was certainly the intention. This happened Thursday. So we don't have all of the answers as to how this might apply. For your specific question about the accessibility metric, I do not believe you will be counting HOV as transit for purposes of
I mean, I would
access
think
because
van
that-
pools
Yeah.
you should have in transit. Maybe.
Say that one more time.
Van pools perhaps should be in transit, but I don't think a car with 3 people
I don't think
belongs
So,
in
It's
transit.
that
so
aggregate.
we still have some work to do to figure out how that statement sort of trickles down through the metrics or the objectives. So I'll say that
in
is
the past, it hasn't been that aggregated
correct.
to say that one is HOV and that one's a van. It doesn't. We're up here, not down here. Anything else, Keith?
No, I don't want to take any time away from the committee in what it needs to do this evening.
Okay, so you need us to tell you what the percentages are for each one? Is that what we're trying to, all right, it's time to wrestle, all right.
Go one by one. And we have
All right.
associates ready, so.
Does the staff have a starting point for discussion?
Well, yeah, we don't have a recommendation.
Understood, it's not a recommendation, but
Yes,
just,
but we have, in one of the documents you shared earlier, we had a few suggestions where we may start. And one place to start is that we have 3 goals. If you think that they are more or less equally weighted, each goal could get about 3.3 the percentage of the rates. And each one will get 3.3. Now, under each goal, you have different numbers of measures. So you can then split that 33.3 into in whichever way you think is important for those measures. Then once we have that way, you can then maybe move around some more depending on the relative importance you see among the measures. And that's one way to do it. Other way to look at is going to the other end of it. You have 10 measures, 10 points for each of them, and then kind of go back and forth to see how you want to achieve that relative importance.
So 2 questions. First, in the past, I remember for each category, it's not that the measure of effectiveness, like VMP, is used directly. It's you rank all the projects from 0 to 100, relatively speaking, and then you use that score and apply the weights here, and then calculate the final score. Is that still the practice?
Yes.
Yeah, so we are still going to be normalizing each performance metric within its own
Mhm.
category so that the top scoring value is essentially 100 points. And each will be sort of normalized based off that. So if you get 90% of that top scoring project, you will get 90 points in that category. And that way, once we have weights, we'll be able to combine them all together into one.
The second question, do we have the percentage number or weights we used in the past as a reference point?
Sure, that can be a point we have. It. Actually, if that's the last slide, then you have a slide there.
That's what I sent around. I don't know if you got the email I sent. At that. The trick is that this time around, we've got, in the past, we had reduced congestion and delay, improved travel time reliability, congestion duration, didn't have access to jobs. I remember.
No, you did.
Yeah, we did. There it is. But they're in different segments or different goals. So things got a little flipped around from the last time we did this. So give us a curveball. So we can start the discussion with a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for each one of these goals. My concern with that is that the charge of MBTA with HB 599 is that congestion reduction is given preference. And to do that, I don't think 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 actually addresses that issue.
Actually, if you look back at what you had last time.
It's 60.
No, it really isn't. If you look at how it was split out, it really wasn't all that different from 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Why don't you just round it up to the first measure, then round it up to like 40 points instead of 33.3. Give it a little extra weight.
So 40, then
40,
If you look at that,
30, 30, or 40, 35, 25, whichever.
yeah.
if you look at that table, so
I would argue that it was up to the higher up groups than us to decide whether one goal was more important than another, and they don't seem to have said that.
Ultimately, it is up to the board, but
So I mean,
we need to give our expert opinion as to knowing that the charge is congestion reduction, or what is the wording? What did I say? What did I say so eloquently earlier
for the
today?
funding purposes, yes, the HB 2313 actually said give priority to congestion reduction congestion reduction related to cost.
Give priority to the projects that achieve the greatest congestion reduction relative to cost.
cost doesn't show up anywhere.
No, it doesn't enter into it yet, but greatest
Well,
congestion
I mean,
reduction.
if you're going to take that approach, why don't we just make congestion reduction the only measure?
Hallelujah. Now you're speaking my love language, but
Well,
I've lost that battle before.
We had people who wanted to do that.
Yes, we have had members of the committee in the past say, make that 100%,
Well,
but that doesn't fly.
since I went through this earlier and sent in my ratings ahead of time, I'm just gonna sit back and let everybody
Oh, what
else.
were your ratings?
One moment.
They're on the screen.
I can read it out from top to bottom: 9, 5, 10, 10, 12, 12, 9, 6,
Oh, I see.
15,
Okay.
and 12. Yeah, in this case, it's going from left to right.
No, I got it. My brain is right
So I gave emissions a fairly high rating. But also, duration of congestion. Got a pretty high rating. And what else? Access to jobs. I can't read the titles from here, but
It responds to the performance measures on the slide you have. So is that a way to? Yeah, we can scroll it, yeah.
So you kind of did a third, pretty much.
I started out with
Yeah.
a third, and then worked from there.
which is right.
But, for example, really all the first 5 or 6 measures all relate to travel time. And if you reduce congestion, you increase access to jobs. So.
And, the argument could be, I'm not saying I support this or deny it or whatever, I'm just saying that there's this argument. When you reduce congestion, your vehicle emissions go down. You have cars moving, it doesn't blow out a lot of steam.
Okay. So
So if you're reducing congestion, that automatically reduces vehicle emissions. So if you put more weight on the reduce congestion, you're automatically also helping the vehicle emissions.
same thing, if you give high weight to reducing emissions, you have supported reducing congestion.
But to give, again, it's just past arguments. You give more weight to what HB 599 says. It helps the MBTA meet the mission per the code. Right? We can split hairs on it, but that's been the arguments in the past, is to give that more oomph, if you will.
These are typically rounded to the 5s, correct?
Yes. So I think that.
After we take an hour.
Yeah,
okay.
So I want to know out of
No,
7 or 8 people here,
yeah, this is
and then there are 3 more panels.
No, this is good. This is a good starting point. I appreciate this. Good.
Do we have a spreadsheet? Like the table you have here?
You want to print out?
If you have,
I had that.
no, it's fine. It's fine.
I will look at it. Just give it.
It would go on the tax. I know.
But
Okay, I think this month.
I'm getting.
The way you developed is 35, 35, and then 30. Is percentages. If you're going bottom lining it, between mobility is 35, accessibility is 35, and resiliency is 30. I rounded up or down to get me 100.
Roughly.
So the 9s became 10s and the 12s split between the 15 and the 10.
I'm not allowed to have an opinion. I can answer questions, but that's all.
The survey responses show the kind of the second. The C and D were higher, typically higher than that third. I don't know that we care about the survey responses.
You gotta take it with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
knowing there was a small sample
Small sample.
size. And I don't think a whole lot of people from the outskirts. I don't have facts to back that up. It's just a cause, basically looking at it, absorbing what was said. A lot of those questions were transit oriented, which tells me closer in.
True. We do have it broken out by the different jurisdictions on that same table. So there are some of those performance metrics that come in with different answers between the inside and the outer jurisdictions. Most of them, with I think 2 exceptions, are pretty close between, say, the inner core jurisdiction and the outer jurisdiction. The one that's really different, of course, is reduced traffic congestion, which folks have very different opinions about. But other than that, things are fairly close together with, you know, some differences.
And I can't really argue with the 35, 35, 30. But I'm just one chairman. I'm just the old knucklehead that's been on this committee for this long.
So I remember in the past, we have 2 different lists, right? One transit related, the other one is driving related projects. They are ranked differently. Is that the practice?
I don't remember them being ranked separately. I thought they were combined. You have a,
They should all the projects should.
I thought they were,
But
we had
the first one, I remember.
well, the ranking, the criteria was separated. You have your, and your congestion, then the transit. It was a little bit more segregated in the past. That's what I remember. You did your homework.
So one possibility can be a concern, can be not, it depends on what perspective. For example, in category D, if you have more transit walking biking option, for example, if you run project with that you took both type of projects together, then for some small projects, they can improve bike and run, biking and walking to a great extent. So they run high.
You're talking C2
B2,
or B2?
B2.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I'm now on track. I got it.
But they only affect very small group of users. But if according to this spreadsheet, that 20% weight, so those 20% will carry a lot of weight. If we have a mixed budget. So that is using relative score versus absolute HT reduction. They are both pros and cons. And I suspect that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions at category F, it's a function of VMT, right? The weight
I
category.
see, yeah.
So basically, it's the same as A1. Or
They may be related. In the A1 is person hours of delay. So all VMT produces emissions. Some VMT produces more emissions per mile than others. So they will likely be tied together, but it is possible not just to speed up VMT, but to remove it entirely, say with the transit project or something like that. So they will probably move in the same direction, but it's not guaranteed. And many of those measures, as Frank has pointed out, will move in the same direction as congestion reduction.
Like I'm taking PE. What's your solution?
Please draw a free body diagram.
Stop.
I should be- no.
Like PTSD again.
Strikes me just looking at the numbers there, even if we just took those numbers there and started rounding, that we're going to get a whole lot of 10. So are there a couple that we would think are higher ranked and maybe a couple that are lower ranked that we could sort of even out between those?
I will answer that with the answer from the past iterations of this, is that our goal is to reduce congestion. That should be one of the highest ranked.
Okay.
So reduce congestion and delay, improve travel time reliability, and improve access to jobs should be the upper ranks based on past. That's me talking, as been on this committee for 14 years, but I also understand things change, and that we're starting to give more not preference, but feeling towards more transit for the inner jurisdictions, and the outer jurisdictions are starting to get more transit because of their growth. Silver Line's going out to allow, you got VRE that's looking to expand out past Bull Run, Broad Run, or past Fredericksburg.
I can tell you from having worked with weighting rating schemes for many things over the course of my career, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference what you put in here within reason. As long as you don't go 99 and 1 and 0, within any reasonable range.
That is a
nothing's
very
gonna
fair
change.
assessment. That is a very, so splitting hairs over 5%, is not going to get very far, but my opinion is giving A1 a higher, probably the highest rank. I've got 20, I'm considering 25. And then that, based on, I'm kind of flipping what Frank is put for emissions. I'm taking from emissions, putting it into reduction and delay, as they are relatively same, and it gives the board something to say, hey, look, we're doing congestion reduction. We're good. We're abiding by the Code of Virginia. Well, there are some board members that will not like that idea, but
When you then give more weighting to reducing the duration of congestion, because delay can be made up of a lot of very small delay,
May I
whereas
ask why
the duration.
A1, A2, they are different?
Yes. They're calculated in the same way, but one is for folks in autos, and one is for folks on transit vehicles. It allowed, in the previous transaction, they were combined into one measure.
Mhm.
This would allow, if desired, to give different weighting, and therefore different level of priority to autos versus transit.
So a person in transit does not equal to a person in car.
Say that again?
A person hour spend in car
Yes,
does not equal person who spend in bus.
depending on how you weight those, that can determine that, yes. If you think it's more important to improve travel time for folks on transit, then you can weight that one more highly than improving, reducing delay for folks in autos. So it's felt that that could help if there was a desire to pursue the equity core value. Again, option.
So for Randy, if you would, when you have a moment,
Absolutely.
25. The first thing, 5, 10, 5, 10, 10, 10, 10, 5, 10. Open for discussion. Or give your ratings and tell me to pound sand.
Right,
Either
number
way.
6. For Amy, you got 15, 10, 10, 5, 10, 10, 15, 10, 10, 5.
I don't know, I think that passes.
Right on the curve.
Yeah. I've got too much Doug Fall in me. You just want to be the crazy one that puts 6 and 9s.
We want it to be very crazy.
That's
He was coming up with 3rd. Mathematical guy.
I have the politics in mind on this too.
Having used.
Yeah,
And misused.
the politics. Not to explain why I'm doing it and trying to convince anybody, but just the politics of the whole thing enters into the equation. Yeah, they'll do what they want. We at least give them what we think is our best answer.
I know I'm not supposed to have an opinion here, but can I insert one comment just for the sake of clarity?
Absolutely.
So the last performance measure, G1, our transportation system redundancy. You guys will recall that we talked about that one being the Homeland Security evacuation one. So I know transportation system redundancy can be many things to many people, but it is going to have to legally be that Homeland Security evacuation thing. I don't know if that wants to change anyone's votes, but I just wanted to make sure everybody had that.
Good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, the jurisdictions, roadways.
So
Yeah.
Randy, does all of this, I guess, cost is not,
We're not there yet. The cost that when they do the rankings, they do that reduction of congestion in relation to cost. That's how they rank the projects.
yeah, I
So
can just circle up the public info and number almost everyone will say something about bank, that's that.
right, and that's what that is. But we're not talking
They're
that
not
here.
talking that.
No, the cost doesn't enter into this. There's no way for it to.
Yeah, I understand that. I just wanted to. Sure.
Yep, you got it.
Can you remind me, what's the improved safety and security?
So, of the multimodal transportation system. That's security of VRE
I will
stations,
put that in and then maybe we can.
enhanced
when we can
platforms,
why it is.
improved parking areas, safety lighting for parking areas, that could be.
On the transit side, we specifically have lighting as one of the things, security in particular. There were also, generally speaking, car crashes are tied to higher VMT. So if we have transit projects that are significantly dropping VMT, we want to make sure we consider that as safety improvements as well, even though they're not on the transit system per se.
Yes.
Now, could this program fund an enhanced
Yeah,
incident response system?
I don't know.
But that's,
Question from Frank, could transaction or MBTA fund an enhanced incident response system? Did I get that right?
Not capital improvement.
Yeah, it is.
that is the question. So what do you mean by enhanced response system?
Monitors, pre-positioning of tow trucks, things to clear, New York State has invested heavily in clearing incidents very quickly, which serves both to reduce reduction, improve safety because there are fewer follow-up crashes, and also reduces the length of congestion due to incidents.
Yeah.
So would a project like that would fall into safety and security, right?
Sure. Some of those that you mentioned, like the technology, by cameras and software needed to put all those things together, things like that, probably yes. Buying a truck to wait, or a heavy truck to wait for an incident to happen and moving there, I'm not too sure it will fall under capital infrastructure maintenance, that particular activity, I'm not sure. So that's check and see. But some of those kind of equipments and software, those will fall under ITS or those kind of infrastructure.
so to talk about Dr. Zhu.
Yeah.
Your combined notes, in order for the math to work,
Just
can
to,
we do?
I can just explain, and maybe Dr. Shu can explain it in detail, but what he wanted and.
No, I understand I understand what you're doing, but in order for the math to work, can we do 12 and a half, 12 and a half? Or are we just,
That outweighs the transit riders to a great extent.
okay.
So if the most paid is 90 to 10, then it's 90 to 10 paid.
Right. And my thought process was total of A1 and A2 is 30.
Mhm.
But if you improve the delay in autos, you're really improving a lot of the transit system too, the bus ways. That doesn't, the transit mainly in that measure, I had anyway, was Metro VRE type works. You get the reduction in delay in autos, you get a reduction in delay in buses on the express lanes or on the wherever the buses are running.
Mhm.
So that gets baked into so I was thinking the same as you,
Yeah.
except I kept my weight separate because of that.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it. I didn't know if that was screwing up their mathematics. Yes, it is. But so that's why I was asking if you're calling that equal, can we do 12 and a half, 12 and a half? Does that get the result that you're desiring or not?
No.
Okay.
I mean, if that's 50-50 most paid, then
Yeah.
but we know that's not.
And
No,
so
it's not.
for the two accessibility measures, can I ask
Yeah.
what the intention is there?
Again, I just think accessibility, they should be counted equally in terms of how many persons could have access to that activity center or to that particular, and they should be counted equally no matter what mode they are using.
So that's not split by mode. the C1 and C2.
Mhm.
They're not split by mode. So one is looking at for the total regional population. So C1
Mhm.
is access to jobs for the total regional population.
Mhm.
And then C2 is looking at that same measure by all modes, just for the equity emphasis area calculations. So those EEA populations are included in both. But again, one is a way of saying, do we want to place additional emphasis on improving accessibility for those EEA? So it's not by mode.
Okay.
If that changes your thinking.
Then I think that makes sense. And in that way, I think probably you just assign a weight to the EA population. One counted as 2 or one counted as 3, that's important. You do not have to create a separate measure for that.
We have already created a separate measure for it, and this committee
And the same as person hours. If we believe transit should play a more important role, then we just assign higher weight per person for the transit riders. So that's my take on this. Because if you improve the mode speed, right? Transit before it's 5%, now it's 10%. But based on this formula, that does not make much difference. You still rank high in the transit category.
Okay.
But if you use person hours as the only measure by removing 10% from driving, that's a huge improvement for congestion. Right. So I think instead of creating 2 different category of measures, why don't we just use VMT and VHT per person, or total VMT and
Because the
VHT?
measures have already been approved by the board, I
This
think
is
is the
measures
answer.
of board that we also said yes to. Probably not realizing that this would come up.
I'm not arguing that that might not be a way to do it, but these are the measures we have to work.
Or another way to implement this, the same thing is most 90 to 10%, then the weight 90 to 10% within that 25% total weight or third.
You lost me on that one. Say that again slower.
Okay. So based on your calculation, you have 30% total weight assigned to A1, A2.
Right.
And then based on the mode speed, 90 to 10%, then you just figure out 30, like 27% for driving, 3% for transit.
Yep.
And if you believe transit should be
I
more-
did that without even thinking about it. But again, my thought process on that is that there are more autos out there. I know we're trying to encourage transit, and that's a good thing, and we want more transit. The fact of the matter is, the transportation network as it is now, mainly automobiles. So if we improve that, it filters down into the transit and other aspects of what we're doing here. So that's why that gets the big bang, and then it filters through. I'm concerned of combining those. I'm not arguing that you have to change it. I'm just saying that I'm concerned that that's combining those, not truly capturing the intent of the performance measures that we established. And so we have the performance measure of the autos, performance measure of the transit, showing that transit is getting better, autos is staying stagnant. Well, I don't know how you're going to make that work. I guess that's up to the staff to make this work. You have any questions? Yeah, Kathleen? Or Karen? Sorry, Karen.
Oh, no.
My sister-in-law in my head.
Here, I think we're waiting for Pat Score.
Wait for you, Pat.
Oh, am I supposed to read off or give something?
You can hand
It's going to be
the
that
paper.
then.
Either read it off or hand the paper in like the old college try.
Okay, actually, I had 5 for safety and security, but the more I think, I put a 10 on that because of all the things you hear now, pedestrian and bike safety. Think of that Project Zero that Montgomery County had or something, and they're nowhere near that. But at any rate, let me just go, and I did 20.
For A1, was that 20? For A1 was 20?
A1 was 20.
Okay, thank you.
A2, 5. B1, 15. B2, 10. C1, 10. C2, 10. D1, 10. E1, 10. The emissions, F1 is 5. And transportation redundancy, G1, 5.
Okay, thank you.
There's still,
I can see a consensus there. The only non-consensus is really at the beginning.
Mhm.
Where do we go high elsewhere?
And you move it so that the total line is not right there with the screen split. I'm a
The
big.
total's on the right.
Oh, yeah, I can't read this. I can try to read that one.
Oh,
There you
okay.
go. Thank you.
That's right.
The total is off because they're on.
yeah, the total is off in this case because Dr. shows those
Yeah.
2 values we are not adding into that I guess.
For
So
time being, you can just split half and half to proceed calculation. But I'm
yeah, but we,
not convinced by that.
Well, it sounded like you were closer to 20 and 5 for that one.
Mhm.
And then we have to, what did you,
Do you have a number in mind? What is most speed in the analysis area?
more split
What is
for
most
the
speed,
auto versus
auto
transit.
versus transit in the analysis area?
in the overall region?
Mhm.
Don't, but that's probably close for an overall sort of daily kind of thing. Will be a little bit higher on commute to work. But if I was trying to split out 25 points by mode share, that's what I would do. And then the C1, C2
Oh, half,
question.
half.
Okay.
He just wants to be really different. Frank, you got halves.
No, again, I don't know the percentage of those 2 populations, how they are represented in sphere.
So I think the question is on the C1 and the C2,
Mhm.
sort of how much of a bonus, right? So you were saying, we would weight them by 2. This is a way to do that. So by giving them the same weight as C1,
Mhm.
you're saying they should be counted twice. If you were to give them less, it would be 10 and 5, you're saying they should be counted as 1.5. So that's how to think through that one.
Okay.
That's a good explanation.
Are we, by that explanation, are we giving more weight to things that prove things for the EEA? That's an awful way to say it, but that's what it really is. Is that what we want?
Again,
So C2 is the access to jobs by car, transit, bike for EEA populations. We're ranking that as a 10, just like the access to jobs by car, transit, and bike, just for everybody. Are we giving one more than the other, or unduly more than the other?
So the EEA populations, just one more time, because it gets a little confusing, are included in both of those measures.
Right.
So
We're counting
so we
the-
actually double counted.
that's where I'm going is,
you are double counting. The EEA populations are a small percentage, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, of the total regional population. But so you would be double counting access improvements for them. You would be saying that while we want to improve accessibility for everybody, we believe that
We really want to improve them.
we want to be improving access for EEA groups more than we want to be improving it for everybody else.
You could make the case that these populations have been underserved traditionally for quite some time.
Or that
We're
they're-
included in the EEA population.
If we're,
So EEAs are defined by high concentrations of low-income minority, and I'm leaving something out.
if we're
Income-
only counting
income
them
and
in
other
I
C1,
think it's
Mhm.
non-English speaking populations is the third one. I'm leaving a third one out. So that's how they're defined, is by having very high concentrations of those groups.
just follow the logic, keep the emotion out. We're counting EEA populations in C1. And if we do the same weight in C2, so backtrack, my thought process was these are the same, why not weight them the same? But now I'm starting to reconsider that we've already, if we make it better in C1, then we give the same weight to C2, we're almost elevating them up higher than potentially they need to be.
Mackenzie, can you flip my
Potentially.
ratings for C2 and
You were
D1?
elevating them.
Elevate.
You were certainly doing that.
Yes,
C2 and D1 for me. Feel better. Change C2 to a 9 and D1 to a 12.
So, to your comment, I think, yes, they are included in C1, EEA populations are, but it is an average across the entire region.
right. So I'm trying to reconcile in my head, just for my rankings. It's open, I'm opening the discussion because I want everybody to think, make sure they're getting the right values in. I don't want to punish, definitely not punishing. But are we giving too much to that? And that's an open air question. I don't have an answer.
The way I'm looking at this is with the EEA communities, these communities have been disinvested for a very long time, and they have not been competitive in the scoring process. And what this is supposed to do is to make them more competitive, to give them the improvements such as sidewalks, bikes, and all of those things to make their transit system work within that community. Right now, the investment that's needed in these communities is significantly higher than it should be because of decades of disinvestment. And so it's saying we're improving the transit system as a whole, but we're making careful consideration to an area that we know is lacking even the basic necessities to make them competitive. Is the way I look at it.
Okay.
I'm with Karen on that one.
Maybe then not arguing. We also have to keep the main goal here is the reduction of congestion and delay.
So right now, these communities rely on cars. So the assumption is if we can give different travel options, then the reliance on cars would be less, therefore congestion is less. But as it stands right now, there's no release for that congestion management in those areas.
But in this measure, it doesn't, you see too, it says by car, transit, or bike. You don't take into account whether or not a working car is available to the people who live in these areas, do you?
That is true. So it is only access, not necessarily.
It's whether the
something-
network is there,
That is true.
not whether they actually have access to the network.
But so I think there's a couple of things in what you had said, yes, giving them other transportation options, but also making sure that we're focusing, even on the congestion reduction, is making sure that that happens in those communities, those equity communities as well. So it would, because it includes all three modes, it would really be across the board, we're looking at that accessibility. But yes, it does not matter if the access by car does not matter if the folks living there necessarily own a car, that is true.
In fact, if you drove a freeway through their neighborhood, you'd improve their access. Is that correct?
Only if there's also an on and an off ramp.
So ain't necessarily a good thing.
In some ways, yes.
How do we feel about this stuff? Bottom line is the mobility has 42%, the accessibility has 32.2, let's call it 32. Resiliency is 26.
Do you want to change your numbers based on the EEA?
Oh. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not going to change the world, but it's
Yes, 7.2 currently is equal there, 10.9 and 10.3.
yeah, and actually BEA is higher, which is not a bad thing. I'm concerned we're not addressing the core reason for doing all this is the reduction of congestion. That's where the political realities of everything comes in. If you're not addressing the congestion, you're not abiding by the law of the code of Virginia. That being said, 42% weight in that realm of the congestion, I think answers the question.
If you add vehicle emissions to that category, then that's 50.
Yep. Any comments from how this is turning out? Everybody, can we have a consensus on whether we like this or not?
So if we were to round these, it looks like A1 would be a 15, A2 would go down to 5, but everything else would round to 10.
Well, we may not be doing that. Case list
Which gets us right back to where we started, right?
We may not be doing that rounding at this point. We probably-
Yeah, Chair Boyce, the rounding would only happen after we've averaged the three committees.
Okay,
Understood.
okay,
It was
sorry about
just
that.
one of those points of, we just went around the room for about an hour going to whether we're going to do a quarter or a third. Let's do 40, 35, and 25, and then we wound up being 40, 35, and 25. It's a worthy exercise, but
Yeah, I think the key thing really is for that average suggested weight for each of the 10 measures. It does the committee overall feel comfortable? Now, if you do, then fine. We'll move forward with that, assuming you take action on that. Alternatively, you as a body could look at those numbers and tweak them without redoing the polling. So we'd have to create an extra line in the spreadsheet to kind of include a line which says maybe recommended weight. But if you're comfortable that the average would be your recommended, then we don't need to change anything or you don't need to change anything.
Are we good with? Essentially, let me just bottom line, if we just round those. A1, A2, B1, B2 gets 40. C1, C2, D1 gets, what was that, 30, 35, then 25 at the end for E and F, G. Do we have to, this is a motion to do this?
Yeah.
By legal?
Well, before you do it, just remember what we need is weighted performance measures. So those numbers look like they are the goals. So the numbers, we need 10 numbers, basically 10 weights from you for the performance measures.
Okay. Which is the 15.7, 6.7.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be the row you'd need to change.
Yeah.
Now, if you wanted to round those numbers, you could, but there will be rounding later, so you don't need to do that if you're broadly comfortable with the numbers.
I think we're fine with that. I mean, we'll have to round it up there too, but hopefully that adds up.
Yeah, maybe more.
Are we the first group to do that?
Yes.
Of the 3 committees, yes.
See which one has the least.
That's why it may be better to leave the decimal points for now.
Yeah.
Right. Can you round them both up?
Yeah. All right. Anybody want to make a motion on accepting these? Get on with it.
I'll make a motion to accept the adjusted weight.
But if you go with the adjusted, we have 101 now. So probably
Well, that's the rounded, right?
yeah,
We're not
Do you want to
doing
move
the rounded.
A2 to 6 instead of 7?
Yeah.
2 to 6.
There you go.
Yeah. You change that just to.
I don't think 7/10 is going to make a whole
I just
lot of
wanted
difference.
Really?
So we have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Approved, unanimous.
Thank you. Now,
I still just tried.
One more thing.
well,
You gotta start talking now. Thank you, committee. It wasn't as painful as I feared.
Hey, boy, if you could go to the next.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Don't let me hold you up.
Okay. You can go directly, or maybe just quickly brief on the first 3 scenarios maybe, and then go to the one where we really need that.
I think that's Sri's way of telling me to go quickly.
Yeah. It's, well beyond the 59-minute rule.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to talk very quickly about scenarios. One of the things we've talked about a couple of times in the past is this notion of, well, what if something happens and how do we account for that in our future forecasting? And so I think if this past year and a half has taught us anything, is that none of us know what's going to happen at all. And it's silly of us to pretend that we do, but yet here we are forecasting 30 years into the future anyway. So one of the things that NBTA includes in the transaction process is scenario analysis to understand what are some potential alternative futures So trying to understand those what if possibilities. So we're looking at what we call sort of plausible futures, things that could happen, that might happen, that we want to be able to learn from and potentially make decisions around. We're not looking for what is the preferred future. We're not necessarily saying these are the most likely futures. We're just saying these are all plausible and we should consider that uncertainty when we're making decisions. So all of these scenarios are assumptions based, right? We use the latest research and things like that to try and figure out what those assumptions be. But they will inevitably be wrong. I don't often get to say that, but it's true. But what we want to use these for is to help identify sort of a number of things, but one of the big ones is identify potential investment obsolescence, which is a lot of syllables, but is really trying to get at the fact of will these investments that MBTA is making still be good ideas if? And so what comes after the if is the really big question. So we've talked about very briefly before the 4 scenarios that we're looking at. And we're going to go a little bit more into detail, but just a little bit through what those 4 what if scenarios that we're thinking about.
You said 4 what ifs. Is that in addition to a continuation of present?
Yes.
And there are 5 altogether.
Yes. So the evaluation metrics and the primary decision making around funding for the next 6-year program all happen based on a standard future forecast, which is a continuation of existing patterns, but pre-pandemic existing patterns. So assuming that that universe continues by 2045 to exist. Speaking of the pandemic, so the first scenario that we, of course, have to look at is what evolves with the pandemic, right? So what trends that have happened over the last year and a half continue into the long-term future. I have my fingers crossed for sweatpants and sneakers at work, but we all have our own preferences there. So we have, and you can see them on your slide, sort of the list of assumptions that would be necessary in order to figure out what the scenario would look like. So big, important assumptions around percent of continued teleworking for different types of jobs, different types of employers, the future of teleschool, the future of e-commerce versus actually going to the store and trying on a pair of jeans, those sort of things. And those are the big, huge travel pattern shifts that we've seen over the last year and a half. So thinking about if those take hold on a more permanent basis, what does that look like for travel patterns? That'll give us an idea of what happens to congestion, what happens to transit ridership, things like that. We've also seen shifts in vehicle ownership, right? So if we're talking long-term, are there folks who didn't own a car before that suddenly feel the need to? Are there households that owned multiple cars before that maybe felt like they could pull back on that since they're both not commuting every day or things like that? So those are some things like that. We've seen increases in non-motorized travel, walking, biking, all of that fun stuff. There are 2 big sort of questions that we've been talking about with the technical groups that we need to think about a little bit. So one is potential long-term changes to the land use forecasts. So we've all heard the stories about how Manhattan emptied out and everybody moved to wherever, and how in the future everybody's going to live in tiny suburban small towns instead of near where the offices are, because why would they need to go to work? So the question, the thought here is, how do we address that, both people potentially leaving the region residentially, but still continuing to work here? And how do we address also sort of shifts in what happens to the office market if nobody has offices anymore? So thinking about what that looks like from a transportation perspective, not necessarily from an economic benefit perspective, which is interesting analysis that somebody else will have to do. But that's really interesting. And then the other piece that remains very much up in the air is the change in willingness to use transit. And so we've all seen fewer people are commuting, so fewer people are taking transit because they don't have to go anywhere. So why would they take transit? Also, with congestion down, there's less motivation for folks who have a choice to take transit. But in the long-term future, if we're all still frightened of being in a room together without masks, is there some sort of fundamental shift in how people think about transit that we want to incorporate into a scenario like that as well?
Are you looking for answers?
I mean, if you have all the answers, Frank, I will take
No,
them
no,
from you.
are you looking for thoughts?
I'm looking for thoughts or questions in keeping with Shu's direction to debrief.
If you have any burning questions, please write it
No,
down.
I have a comment. I don't see how you can do the telework issues without addressing the land use issues.
For the changes in willingness to use, I mean, is there like a scenario, just different age cohorts for seeing a,
Yeah, I mean, that's a little more detailed than we're able to get in this type of analysis, but I do get that. We have to make, again, some sort of broad assumptions that, okay, this portion of the population might have those impacts, this other portion of the population might not, and apply those fairly broadly, but we don't have that level of detail on the population side.
Let me go back to the land use side. Aren't you constrained to use the CAI land use forecast no matter what?
That is a very interesting and very political question. We certainly have to use them for the standard land use. Our question here, and we asked this to the RJAC last week. Today's Monday, it has to be last week. We asked this of them last week, in particular because they're the staff at the jurisdictions, right? And we have gotten that pushback before of we don't want any changes to the regional land use assumptions. I think there was some level from that group at least, recognition that this would be such a departure from what was being planned for, that it would be difficult not to consider it, but they did not want to consider something where everybody moved to Denver or Danville for that matter. So there were some limits on what they were, because then it's not useful. But understanding that, okay, if everyone is teleworking 4 days a week, that will have land use impact. So that's about as far as we've gotten so far. Okay. Other thoughts or questions on this one?
I'm not seeing a long-term reversion of transit. I'm starting to see it come back already because the congestion is back up almost to normal, at least in PM.
So hopefully we have a couple more months before we have to actually implement this and we can start to observe a little bit more, right? Like we're in particular for that one, we're trying to hold off as long as we can to make the decision because we want as much observed data as we can get. Yeah, it's also really hard to judge in DC right now because Metro keeps cutting their service.
Yeah,
Which
it's anecdotal. I'm looking at VRE trains getting full again. Not my asses.
Okay.
Moving on.
So our second scenario is a technology scenario, which is focused really on the implementation of connected, automated, shared, and electric vehicles, which we're condensing to case because it's shorter to say and easier to spell. And so there are a lot of assumptions that need to go into this as well. Assumptions about market penetration, about all those technologies, about how much they cost both to own and to use, what those services, particularly in a shared environment, look like, and some of the more physical assumptions, increases in roadway carrying capacity, reduction in crashes, things like that. We had two particular questions here. One again was around the land use. There's been some speculation that with widespread adoption of automated vehicles on the one hand, and these case vehicles on the other hand, could have sort of impact on where people choose to live. Folks thinking that if you have a car that can drive you a very long way by yourself, why wouldn't you move all the way down to Fredericksburg and have it do that for you? has been one thought. The other thought is that a lot of people might choose to move into slightly denser areas where they have access to these shared vehicles a little bit more. So there's competing views. They'll probably both happen, and they might even wash themselves out. So there seems to be a little bit less of a need to diverge from the COG land use forecast on this one. Is as I say, very limited direction we've gotten so far. And then there was also a question raised at one point about adding in, if we're able to automate transit and thus remove the operators from the transit vehicles, cutting the operating costs for transit, should we dramatically increase the transit service? So if we're able to have the cost, should we double the frequency? And see what that would look like.
I think that would perturb the analysis.
Okay.
I don't think it's likely to happen, and I think it gets you away from looking purely at technology.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Right. Your point of things washing out, I think that's true. People like me are never going to live downtown. And there's other people that want to live downtown.
We're crazy.
Yeah, you are.
For so many
Downtown will
reasons.
come to you.
Yeah.
You stay where you are.
Already has.
Okay. Okay. Taking a look at the third scenario. And this one is really built around the notion of incentives or pricing to help manage transportation and travel demand in the region. So the pandemic has been one way to manage travel demand, not one anyone supports. This would be sort of an economic way to manage travel demand. So we've thought of a number of different options. Some of these come out of the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan from NBTA, but they fall sort of in the incentives to use either alternative modes or to switch out of congested time periods, and then some pricing carrots and sticks, we'll call them, right? So we've got incentives to use alternative modes, being making transit free, potentially providing incentives for carpooling, things like that, incentives to shift your travel time. So there's a program that's been run through COG and the University of Maryland. I believe it was called Incentric, that's the name of the app, where they would try and change your behavior by providing you with Amazon points or Starbucks points, one or the other, to if you were willing to shift your trip a half an hour outside the peak of the peak or something like that. So it would be a system like that designed to help encourage people to get us more towards system optimal transportation instead of individual optimal. We'd be looking at changes to parking and curbside pricing, so making sure that that represented a way to manage demand. But the big sort of pricing element of this would be thinking about a roadway pricing structure. And so the question we're asking is, there's a number of ways you could structure roadway pricing mechanisms, right? The two of the most common that we talk about are VMT pricing or congestion pricing. But it could also be something that looks like a cordon charge. It could also be carbon pricing if that's the direction we wanted to go in. So the question we're asking folks is there one of those that sounds more interesting that you think we could learn more from? And given that all of these are politically very difficult to push through, so from an understanding perspective, from gaining knowledge and information, does one of those structures speak to you more than others?
We already have congestion pricing, express lanes.
And we also have BMT pricing with the gas tax, essentially. Yeah.
In a roundabout way, but what they're talking about is punishing those that live far out that have to drive in.
Well, we already do that.
When I say punish, let me clarify my statement. So we have people that cannot afford to live in this metro the box areas because of the cost of living in there. So they have to live, or not have to, they choose to live the far-flung areas so they can afford what they want. And that's, and a VMT is punishing those that cannot afford to live in an area where there's a lot of transit. It has the potential, has the potential to be a punishment.
There are differences, right? So in a VMT pricing scheme, right, no matter where that VMT is happening, whether it's congested or not, and so therefore for people who have to drive longer distances to get somewhere, no matter what, because there are no other options, all of that gets charged, and they would incur higher costs. That's true. Whereas in a congestion pricing version, even if we're applying it not just on the hot lanes, but universally, if there's nobody else on that road you're using, it's okay, you can use it for free. It's only when there's congestion and we want to mitigate that we would implement those tools. So there are differences in how those work out.
In terms of change in travel behavior, parking pricing is things will be much more sensitive to parking pricing than the other ones.
So I that's definitely on our list, and I don't think it has to be an either or. But so I think I'm hearing more interest on the congestion pricing.
I was answering the question of, yeah, there's interest in it because we're already doing it. So I hesitate VMT just for reasons I espoused. Yeah, there's benefits to it. Yes, I get it. I understand it.
Is that done anywhere? I mean, certainly congestion pricing. I know at least London does that, but does anyone do VMT pricing currently?
I don't believe it's been implemented yet.
Yeah, I can think of any place.
In the US.
London is really more cordon pricing.
No, true.
As is Singapore.
Yeah. The places that are, there are no American countries that do it yet.
Okay.
New York, who approved some phase of analysis of it in the last couple of years, but again, they're working on how they implement that. Whether that would be true congestion pricing, or again, Manhattan has a real convenient cordon that they can use.
True.
So they're not sure about that either. That's likely to be the first American example whenever that happens. But it's been discussed for a really long time as an alternative to the gas tax, in particular as more vehicles start to go electric and as mileage per gallon has continued to go up. Folks are getting less gas tax for the amount of VMT that
How does cost come into the distribution function?
Say this one more time.
How does cost come into the trip distribution function?
I have to check. I'm not sure it does. I know it's in mode choice though.
Okay, but if you were really going to significant VMT
Yeah,
pricing,
I have to check on that one. I'll get
you would
back to
have
you
to
on that.
have cost in the whole
Yeah.
trip distribution.
Let me
And you
double
probably
check.
have to eliminate balancing to attractions. If that's still done.
Let me ask my expert.
Oh, equity considerations. And or is that going to be a part of regardless of what price?
Can you say the first part again? Sorry.
Equity considerations.
The
Equity.
equity.
Yeah.
Considerations.
So that's a great question. And I think we don't know in particular yet. Again, so these scenarios aren't necessarily what we're recommending. I think we could learn from either of these that, hey, it might have disparate impacts on different social groups, different economic groups. We may want to consider, is there a subsidy for low income folks up to a certain level of VMT or something along those lines? I don't think we could develop those policies in advance of seeing the results, but they could help lead policy development later.
Yeah, I guess my question is really, as we're looking at these roadway pricing structures, is equity considerations going to be a part of that analysis?
Like what? I want to understand so I can answer correctly.
Well, let's say, for instance, we do congestion pricing.
Yes.
Is there going to be consideration as to like, I know like when they were doing the discussion for the Dulles Toll Road,
Mhm.
and they were coming up with a pricing for that.
Mhm.
There was concern about higher costs during times that would impact shift workers.
Yeah.
And who would not be able to afford that congestion, that price. And so even though it theoretically worked, it would have had a massive impact on particular.
So I don't know how detailed we're going to be able to get in the initial assumptions that go into the scenarios, although we can come up with them and implement whatever we like. But I do think whatever comes out of this is going to be really instructive for moving forward. So are there those policy concerns that we need to look at if these are being pursued by anyone, whether it's congestion pricing, BMT pricing? We'll at least be able to see what some of those are, even if we're not going to be able to design a scenario to fix them yet. That's the best I can say.
So is this something MBTA wants, or is this something the research team recommends? Or, so those scenarios,
Mhm.
I know it's kind of a sensitivity test, but is that something MBTA has in mind as part of this 6-year plan development process?
Answer, but no, this is again similar to what we did last time. We are not picking any preferred scenario. This is what we want. So this is how we are. These are the type of projects we want to put it there. But this is more of a sensitivity, as you rightly said. We have our plan, and then under different features, where will our plan fit in? Will some of our investments become obsolete if particular scenario plays out, versus will certain investments will work whichever future scenario plays out. That is just to understand that our plan performs under certain scenarios.
And I think, oh, sorry.
No, I just want to say, whatever scenarios we choose at the end, for those assumptions, I think we need to agree on what kind of assumption we're going to make. For any of them, I think there are so many degree of freedom in the model that we probably do not have a good grasp on. So, for example, free transit, how that would shift the mode, like affect the mode speed, peak time, how that would affect long-term residential location choice. We do not know. There is no empirical evidence out there that can help us to answer these questions. So, to some extent, the assumptions we make regarding how the model would fit, like data would be fit into the model, probably has a larger impact on those scenarios.
Yeah, no, and we will be wrong, right? We'll do 4 scenarios and we'll be wrong about all of them, but it is about sort of the what if and the directionality of it. So we can assume, all the parking pricing in the region doubles, but if in reality it triples, that will have different effects. But directionally, we'll have learned.
No, what I'm trying to say is, we assume it's going to double. How that's going to affect the mode speed, depart time choice, it's still, we do not have good grasp on that.
I mean, the best we can do is run it through the modeling tools that we have. And I think it's particularly true for things that don't exist yet, right? The connected automated vehicles, some of the pricing schemes. There have been analyses, they're probably also wrong, but we're doing our best with the tools we have.
Yeah,
That is true.
Yeah. I just want to try to point out that we have to agree on what kind of assumptions we can make regarding the behavior reaction to that before we conduct all those kind of actions.
Okay.
I think in the past, for example, for the national evacuation scenario, we agree that it's going to be 10% increase in demand, 10% decrease in demand. And I believe the OD tables are fixed. There will be no major paradigm shift because of that, but we know that's probably not true.
Okay.
So that's just.
I mean, there are some simplifications we're going to have to make. Right? We can't accurately represent all of this. That is absolutely true. So we will put together more than 4 slides on what the assumptions are, for sure. But for today, this is where, as far as we've got. And then the last one, which is where I want to use some, was thinking about a climate change scenario. And our original thought around the climate change scenario has been to look at what might happen to the transportation system if we lost specific pieces of infrastructure to climate change. So to flooding, inundation, things like that. So looking at the floodplains, thinking about GW Parkway down by Mount Vernon, thinking about certain pieces of the VRE track, thinking about National Airport, things that might in fact be underwater or close to it by 2045. What would happen? How would our system operate if that was the case? That was our original thought on what this scenario might look like, and we can still do that if people find that of interest. But the other one that has sort of been brought to the attention since then has been, if we think about the 3 scenarios that we just talked about, might there be some interest in combining pieces or strategies from those 3 scenarios to see what that looks like from a demand management perspective and from an emissions management perspective. So thinking about the electric shared vehicles that we have in the technology scenario, thinking about the increased telework perhaps that we have in the pandemic new normal, thinking about some of the pricing strategies that might be involved in the scenario we were just talking about. It's a question of if we pulled those 3 things together, what would that do from an emissions perspective? And so that was an alternative version of a climate change scenario, which is, a little bit different. One of the things we've heard though a lot from folks is about all the work that COG has been doing on the climate change area and not wanting to come up with anything that's sort of contrary to the work that they're doing there and not really step on their toes in that work. So we want to think of, from our perspective, and it can be something that's on this page, it can be something else entirely, would be the most useful to understand from the perspective of a what if for Northern Virginia and for transaction.
But just to be clear, MWCOG, what they're looking at is the more, should these facilities be underwater or whatever, et cetera?
What COG has been looking at is what would it take to achieve the region's climate goals, and can we do it from a transportation perspective? So they've looked a lot at what would it take to achieve certain reductions in DMT, certain mode splits, to transit certain electrification rates in order to achieve, and I'm going to get the goal entirely wrong, but I think it's a dramatic reduction in carbon by 2030 or by 2040, something along those lines.
Got it.
And so that's a lot of the work they've been doing. They've been doing it at a regional level, as in a COG regional level, not a Northern Virginia regional level. But Northern Virginia falls within that.
What they're doing is akin to your second bullet.
So yes, but I don't think they've gone quite that far with some of the technology and policy. So on the electrification piece, yes, I think they have looked at that. I don't believe they've done anything looking at the pricing and incentives. I don't believe they've yet gone so far as to incorporate, say, post-pandemic telework patterns, although it's certainly something they could continue to look at. So that second bullet would fall more akin to what they are doing than the first. But this would be something very specific based on our 3 scenarios and what we might learn from them.
I'm kind of leaning towards learning about each of the scenarios separately before trying to figure out a hybrid.
That does make sense. And we should have the ability to do that if that's sort of the agreement. Right, so we can learn some things and then design the fourth scenario.
It would be interesting to identify pieces of the system that would be affected by climate change.
So that I believe has been done.
And I don't know if it's necessary to do anything more than that.
So I do believe that some of the climate change action plans have looked at which pieces of infrastructure are most likely to be susceptible to various kinds of climate change and the timelines for those. So if we were doing a scenario based on that, we would use that work to inform the assumptions of what would happen. We've also sort of had the thought of, well, we know that the JW Parkway is at risk, so someone's going to engineer something to raise it up to fix it, to harden some of that infrastructure. So how worthwhile is doing the scenario that proves that we actually need the JW Parkway in the future? So we can make arguments on all sides of this, which is why we're asking the question. Because I can talk myself into and out of all of them.
I did have one question, but it's going back to the pricing scenario. You had mentioned what's it called, carbon pricing. How would that work? I know we didn't do the analysis, but what does it look like?
So carbon pricing is essentially so different types of vehicles emit carbon at different rates. And so you're charged essentially for the carbon that you're emitting into the atmosphere, as opposed to the miles that you're traveling or the congestion that you're contributing to directly. So in the long-term future, if we're looking at a very significant electrification rate, this would potentially only apply to non-electric vehicles. It's an issue. It could also, more advanced models of it could think of where the electricity you're using to charge the electric car, but that becomes very complicated. But it does only then apply to a subset of vehicles.
And I can see a lot of equity issues with that.
Sure. Newer cars emit less, absolutely.
Would that then tie into the TCI or is that separate?
Say that one more time.
Is that thinking of the congestion pricing, is that because of consideration of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or is that just one of the pricing scenarios that are out there? So let's look at it.
That's one of the options for constructing a scheme. I don't necessarily think it's the one we recommend as being the most instructive for this region, especially considering the high electrification rates that are expected by 2045 in the region. But, you know, just throwing them out there.
Thank you.
We can share these slides, we will share these slides and can send us your comments, any more suggestions you have as a follow-up.
Otherwise, that's all I have to say. That is his favorite part of every movie.
The end, yes. MBTA updates, member updates.
Sure.
Members is leaving.
I don't have a lot more to update. We already discussed about what they will be considering at their next meeting, December 8th. They will consider recommendations of the rates from all the three committees and come up with their own final approval of the rates. That is going to be the major agenda item for the next meeting. That's what I have. We had that last meeting, they obviously approved the measures, and Chair Boyce was there to brief the authority members on what activities you all have been doing over the 1 year, and to give them a little bit more deeper understanding of the decision making that reached to that particular recommendation of public use, forcibly use measures. Thank you.
Mrs. Turner is leaving our fine committee. She's retiring. What's the effective date?
I said I'd come to the December meeting.
Okay.
January.
Done.
Is there going to be a December meeting? I noticed you saying next meeting to be determined.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up too. So next steps we had that slide here. So the question is, at this point, we don't see any other action item unless the authority have their decision-making doesn't go the way we are expecting that there is on the meeting. We don't expect any action item for you all in December. There might be some information items, but depending on the volume of that, we may or may not need a meeting. I don't want you for you all to
Fine
come
to not
here
have
for
a meeting. I'm
half an
all
hour
about
information.
that. If we do need one, then we'll schedule one.
But we have a date, December 15th in our calendar, so we can hold on.
We can't have a private one because we, break that 3-person rule.
That's the 5 minutes you gave us today.
You can have a hearing on YouTube.
Not doing the Zoom Christmas party. So, okay.
If we don't meet in December, from staff perspective, we wanted to thank.
That could be anticlimactic for you. This could be your last meeting.
Oh, well, I miss all you guys, but not the trip over here. I tell you, as you get older, I used to laugh at older people that said, oh, I've got to get to my car, get home before dark. Well, I'm telling you, in, the Beltway and everything dark.
I'm with you, driving at night is getting harder and harder.
It's especially fun in the rain.
The older you get, seems like the lanes get skinnier. You have to I find myself.
We'll miss you and thank you for multiple years of service. You and I have had lots of fun together, and that's fun.
Seen a lot of things coming back.
So we'll make sure not leave Washington on the table.
That's right. All right, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
There we go. All right, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
If you oppose, too bad.